This week on the Quillette podcast, I'll be interviewing the director of Speechless, which is a great new two-part documentary film about free speech that just appeared on the CBC and BBC. Yes, you heard that right. The CBC and the BBC are now airing Quillette-approved liberal takes on free speech. Crazy times, right? To make sense of what you're about to see, let me give you some personal backstory. So, as I sometimes mention, I live in a fairly left liberal neighborhood in Toronto. There are lots of media types and university professors, and we all basically get along fairly well, especially if we have dogs, because no one wants to get into a heated political debate when you're out walking your mutt. One of these neighborhood dog owners is my guest today, Ric Esther Bienstock, who, it turns out, is a pretty famous documentary filmmaker. About 8 years ago, around the time I was starting to work at Quillette, Ric told me that she was working on a documentary about free speech on campus. Every time I saw her, she'd be talking about it. She even floated the idea of me participating in the project. And finally, I just said, Ric, let's just talk about our dogs. I get enough of this cancel culture free speech stuff when I'm at my desk doing my Quillette day job. And to be honest, I thought Ric's project was doomed to failure anyway. The free speech landscape was changing every day back then, it still is, and making movies takes a long time. So I thought her project was somewhat hopeless, since as soon as she'd prepared a final cut, the thing would be outdated. And besides, who was going to air this thing anyway? Not the CBC, I figured. At the time, and even now to some extent, many CBC journalists seemed to actually be cheering on cancel culture. But Ric proved me wrong. Her creation, whose premiere I attended earlier this month in Toronto, is a thoughtful retrospective on the last decade or so of illiberal progressive mobbing and censorship campaigns. From Bret Weinstein's disgraceful treatment at Evergreen State College in 2017, through the gender wars and the vilification campaigns against gender-critical women such as J.K. Rowling, and on into 2023 and beyond, when campuses were rocked by protests and encampments led by aggressive activists whose rhetoric sometimes veered into terror apologism and calls for violence against Jews. As I was watching Speechless, I realized that campus cancel culture, a term that now seems somewhat antique, has been around long enough that it deserves an authoritative historical treatment. And Speechless provides that, thoughtfully focusing on a handful of major case studies, no fewer than 5 of which center on figures who will be well known to loyal Quillette readers and podcast listeners. Again, Bret Weinstein, but also Eric Smith, a former professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania, philosopher Kathleen Stock, formerly of Sussex University, former Harvard evolutionary biologist Carol Hooven, and right-wing culture warrior Christopher Rufo, whom Ric and her producer accompanied as he was leading the teardown of DEI programs at New College in Florida, on behalf of his political ally, Ron DeSantis. In our conversation, Ric discusses why she devoted so much of her life to this project, almost a decade in the end, and how she successfully sold her 2-part documentary to the CBC, the BBC, and a number of non-English markets in Europe as well. She also discusses her own personal intellectual journey during the process. Like me, she's a middle-aged Jewish Canadian liberal who spent much of her time since the mid-2010s trying to figure out how the good intentions originally embedded in diversity, equity, and inclusion became a radicalized cult of eggshell emotional fragility and censorship, while turning many campuses into intellectual milieus where there is only one single acceptable view on issues connected to race, gender, and, it turns out, Middle Eastern politics. Please enjoy my interview with acclaimed Canadian documentary filmmaker, Ric Esther Bienstock. Ric Bienstock, thanks so much for joining the Quillette podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right, there's a lot to discuss here, but the first question I'm going to ask, what was the one incident or epiphany or observation that started you down the road of this project? I guess it was almost a decade ago?
It was almost a decade ago. Actually, it was more than a decade ago. In 2015, I read an article in Atlantic magazine, The Coddling of the American Mind, which subsequently became a book. But at that time, it was just covered students trying to be protected from emotional harm, needing safe spaces, words like microaggressions, cultural appropriation. There was this period of time with all this these new expressions that I was unfamiliar with at the time, which I'm very familiar with now. And I just thought that did not reflect my experience when I went to university, needing a safe space, not from physical harm, but from emotional trauma. And also hearing things like words being harmful. And I remember an example at the time where law students at Harvard Law didn't want rape law on the exam because it would potentially trigger them. So that was just, first I thought it was quirky, interesting. And I also wanted to know, is this really true? Is this what's happening on campuses?
You picked 5 protagonists for your film. Some of them will be familiar to our guests. You have Bret Weinstein over at Evergreen State.
Bret Weinstein was really the beginning of my journey because I was researching the film, and there was an event at Yale Law School with Professor Christakis and his wife.
Nicholas Christakis, yeah.
And she had written an email about Halloween costumes in response to some administrator had sent an email out about how Halloween costumes, it was almost Halloween, we should be careful not to offend people. And she wrote a letter to people in her residence that she was responsible for saying, hey, maybe Halloween costumes, maybe Halloween, we could just don't be so easily offended. You are grown-ups. She was articulating it much better than I'm articulating it now. But the students really fell apart in protest, and her husband, there was amazing footage of her husband in the middle of the quad at Yale being yelled at by these students about how much harm this email caused. In fact, when I first saw that footage, I was trying to find the letter that she wrote because I thought it must have been a completely racist, horrific letter, but it was such a sensitive letter. I only mention that story isn't in the film because that happened. But as I was researching this, I started seeing on social media live streaming of Evergreen State College students, that's on the west coast of the United States in Washington State, live streaming a takeover of a college. I was not even in production, but I literally got on a plane, called a colleague of mine who lived in LA, who knows how to shoot, and I said, come meet me in Olympia, Washington, where this school is. I don't know who I'm going to interview. I don't know what I'm going to get, but I just wanted to be there and try and capture things.
One of the reasons I found the film so striking is you're there in the room during a lot of this stuff going on, witness to history type stuff. And it struck me that because you're a Canadian filmmaker, maybe they didn't know your name. And it was like, hi, I'm from Canada. I want to be a fly on the wall. That was possible in a way that maybe would not have been possible if you were, say, someone from Fox News or like a known quantity in the American cultural space.
I'm not sure. I mean, maybe that was it. But also these students, I mean, I'm running around. It's just me and one other person. So I'm not there with a big crew. And I was running around just trying to make sense of it.
Well, you weren't just running around. I mean, when they were taking over buildings, you were there.
Some of it, but some of it was just a phone footage.
Okay, but you're in some of the frames.
Well, yeah, I'm in some of the frames because, well, I went. That's absolutely true. But I just mean I was there as part of it. I was hanging around and I befriended some of the students and I told them, I mean, it was a very strange experience because there was a lingo that I was unfamiliar with at the time. And I look back now, I'm so familiar with it. And I say in the film, within a day or so, I was called a white supremacist. And I thought,
what was it that caused you to be
called a white supremacist? There was nothing that triggered it. It was just a matter of fact. It wasn't even said as an insult. It was said because they kept throwing around this white supremacist language, and I wanted to understand what they meant because they were accusing Bret of racism. And I was actually legitimately trying to make sense of it in the moment where I could not, for the life of me, figure out what was racist about it. And now I understand because it's about privilege and white supremacist systems and all the ideology behind it. But at the time, that was very, very new to me. And then started talking to one student and they introduced me to another student. And I realized I'm just going to keep filming and just try and get inside their heads. And I told them that exactly. I said, I don't know if I agree with you, but I just want to know what you really think. And they were kind of open to telling me what they thought. And I said, and I think I remained true to that. I said, I may not agree, but I'm not looking to do a gotcha. Like I'm going to represent you.
Well, so one of the striking things about your film, and I think this will be fresh to a lot of people maybe who are used to seeing documentaries of this type. I think everyone who's seen social media know there's like all these sort of gotcha moments and people who have an agenda. It may be an agenda I agree with or not agree with, but they go out and they themselves are kind of an internet personality, and they're like, they're asking, what is a woman? Or, there was this one guy I just saw who he was making fun of people protesting the war in Iran. He was putting a mic in people's face and saying, hey, don't you think it's very homophobic that we keep talking about the Straits of Hormuz instead of the gays of Hormuz? And the students, of course, were like, yes, it's very homophobic. But like, that wasn't what you were doing. In fact, as a viewer, you were showing some of this footage from Evergreen and other places where the students were saying lunatic stuff. I remember there was 2 students who were interviewing at Evergreen saying, yeah, this is a super transphobic, racist university campus we're on. So your few interjections during the interview, sometimes when they say something particularly lunatic, you kind of ask for a clarifying question, but it's rare.
Because I didn't want to be like a Michael Moore type, or like you say, what is a woman type, going in like that. And I didn't want to be kind of Diane Sawyer type, sitting there with cutaways of me doing an interview. And in the end, I realized my identity was so relevant even to the people I was interviewing. I asked, and I left it in the film on purpose. I asked one of the women, like, what do you want? What's the message you want me to convey? And she goes, send more reporters of color. I left that in because I thought it was important, because it's very much part of the ideology. Like, who you are is fundamental. Who you are, the color of your skin, your sexuality, all of that so much plays into it. And I thought that was really interesting. I realized my identity was fundamental. Otherwise, people would just dismiss the film and go, well, she's just a cis white woman and old, so, forget her. So I thought, okay, I'm leaning into this. I'm the person telling this story.
More as a narrator than an on-the-scene protagonist. And certainly you didn't debate these people. And by the way, you're not that old. You're old enough to remember who Diane Sawyer is, but...
I was going to say Barbara Walters. I was trying to think of someone younger.
Connie Chung wasn't an option because you're a white supremacist, I guess?
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
Exactly.
All right, check yourself. So I recognize most of the people you profiled in the film, largely because a lot of them have contributed to Quillette, Kathleen Stock, Bret Weinstein before he became an anti-vaccine nut. Christopher Rufo has been on the podcast twice, before he was super conservative, just a mildly conservative culture warrior, and probably the smartest, maybe to my mind, like the star of the movie. He's a professor of rhetoric. His story is crazy.
Well, Eric Smith was actually a professor of rhetoric at York College, which is a small college in Pennsylvania. He's a Black man. He is a remarkable person. I have to try and remember how I met. Oh, I went to a Heterodox Academy conference.
Which was started up by Jonathan Haidt, who was one of the authors of that Coddling of the American Mind book you talked about. And he's a friend of Quillette too. So, the whole thing is one big Quillette-orama.
So I met him. I went to that conference for research, just Heterodox Academy, for those who don't know. How would you describe it?
It's fairly apolitical. They have an annual conference, which I typically attend. By the way, there's a Canadian Heterodox Academy contingent, which is large and vigorous. And they're into reasoned debate, intellectual pluralism, freedom of inquiry, the freedom to present evidence without fear of ad hominems and social panics and so forth, and not having discussions about controversial topics be preempted because there's only one approved dogma. And it's not really that conservative an organization. In fact, I think one of the recent meetups I went to, everyone was rightly concerned with Trump and with some of the challenges to free speech that are coming from conservatives these days.
And I just met Eric, among many other people, and I was really interested in him. What was most interesting to me is that he said that he uses, must have been in a conversation, that he uses the Evergreen State College story in his class on rhetoric.
I mentioned the intro, we're friends and neighbors, and you were telling me about this documentary Forever, and I kind of wondered how you were going to make it feel relevant because so much of the stuff is in the past. One of the ways you successfully made it relevant is you brought the viewer into his class, I think it was 2022, where they were looking at footage from Evergreen. You were taking a step back, and he in particular is just such a smart guy that he was trying to make sense of it and help his class make sense of it, how to make a new generation of students understand this mishigas, which took place in the mid-2010s. But anyway, he was the subject of a cancel campaign, right?
He was the subject of a cancel campaign by his own colleagues. But really, I'm trying to tell a story in the film, right? I'm not doing a news piece. I'm not Tucker Carlson doing campus craziness. I'm trying to actually say something that's relevant and understand and look at where this is all going. what got me to him. And then I found out that he had his own counsel story. And his counsel story is he's a professor of rhetoric, as he explains in the film, it's kind of persuasive communication and writing. That's what he teaches. And there is an expert academic at the time in rhetoric and composition. His name is Asao Inoue. He basically thinks that English...
Of other rhetoricians.
Well, I'm glad you point that out, because one of the potential criticisms that, you picked fringe characters.
No. This guy he was given pride of place at a big conference of specialists in his area. And his big theme was rhetoric is racist, logical thought, classical forms of expression. This is all white supremacy. I thought it was like satire, but no, this guy's apparently serious.
Again, I wasn't looking to sensationalize. I mean, you want to tell a good yarn and it's got to be interesting. And I found it, but I mean, I want to get inside it. I'm not doing a piece for Fox News. So Sal believes that teaching English is a tool of the oppressor, but more importantly, that students should be able to write in what Eric calls Black vernacular English or Ebonics, and they should be able to write, and we shouldn't prejudice that kind of writing. And that the only reason that people are speaking and learning English the way we're speaking it now on this podcast is because we keep teaching it that way, and we shouldn't teach it that way. So I agree with you. I thought that was, when I heard that, saw that recording, I was quite surprised to see it. But I mean, as you know, in the film, I did speak with Asao. I went and interviewed him.
And he doubled down. First of all, by the way, based on what I saw, very nice home. Professor Inoue speaks standard English, very eloquent. It's not like he started rapping at you in Ebonics or something like that. He himself seems completely bourgeois in all his professional respects. I thought he was going to sit down with you and say, you know what, I was young, mid-2010, it was a crazy time. People believe this nonsense. But no, he sat down with you and he repeated all of it. So much so that you actually at one point had to push back.
When he said that speaking English results in the killing of Black men.
He stood by that. Speaking English results in people getting killed. And there he was on camera being an accessory to presumptive murder by talking English to you. Sorry, how could you sit there and not blow your Diet Coke all over his face when he said these things just because you couldn't contain yourself at these monstrous idiocies?
What I set out to do was represent people as they really want to be represented. That was my job. I make documentaries.
Right.
So, I mean, and this is not a point of view documentary in the sense that I'm reporting to show you how silly. I want people to think for themselves. And so what goes through my head is private.
Yeah.
No, I don't mean it's private. What I'm saying is that I wanted to know because, like you, I thought maybe he would say it's a metaphor, I'm speaking rhetorically, or what I mean to say is, but I mean, I understood what he said. And at a certain point I said, well, his response to me when I said, how does English link to the killing of Black men? And he goes, if you think I don't belong in this place, if you think, first it's I don't belong here. I'm a threat to you. I'm dangerous to you. And I guess what he means is if someone saunters in and is speaking a real, colloquial Black that I don't understand, and I would be threatened because I don't know where he was going with that, but it's not that I totally didn't understand where he was coming from. But of course, I don't think speaking English results. I mean, he basically said, language is responsible for racism. Language, people use language for it. And there was a point where I actually had a comment in the film where I said, yeah, language is also used to order pizza and write love letters. But then I thought, I don't need to do that. I don't need to highlight what he said. Let him speak, and you can either agree with him.
I appreciate that you kept things very profesh, but let's get back to the story of Eric. So okay. Eric he's on some list server or reply all email chain for other people in the field.
And he says in the film, and I really he goes, he remembers his life before this and after this, because he wrote on the listserv. I don't agree with this.
He wrote what 99.9% of ordinary humans think about the subject.
We got hold of the listserv, and we just couldn't. I mean, I only showed a part of it in the film because you can't keep a listserv that interesting in a film for so long. But they accused him of Stockholm syndrome. They basically called him a white supremacist. He's supporting white supremacist values. He said, I want my students to be successful and happy. It's not like, it's not like saying, let's be a sellout and I'm teaching them English so they can sell out. So I just thought that, and he was completely vilified. And people on the listserv, there were a lot of them that chimed in, some of them white. And they were basically saying, one, you're an Uncle Tom. Two, you have Stockholm syndrome. And also that at one point, there was one person arguing with him. Again, this is not in the film. And someone said, you don't have to respond to Eric anymore on the listserv. You've already expended so much emotional labor responding. You must be exhausted from the emotional labor of writing an email. The other beautiful thing about Eric is that he does talk about Black vernacular English as something of beauty.
Yeah. He says it's a vernacular and it's its own art form, and he encourages people to study it and be interested in it, but it's not the way people express themselves in a typical, say, professional environment.
But there are many people now, and there is a movement. When I say many, I don't know. There is a movement to say, why? Why are we privileging this English? And I wanted to show that in the film.
This is sort of a larger question I had about your movie. The film is called Speechless. It's about free speech. One thing, and this I think applies to a lot of these sort of cancel culture stories from the late 2010s and early 2020s, it's not really about free speech. What happened with Eric, no one was going to a human rights commission saying, oh, this is hate speech and he has to be thrown in jail. What was at risk was that he was being dogpiled and attacked by former friends and colleagues, and he was ostracized. And human beings are social creatures, so that, he said, I had my life before, my life after. Everybody who has a cancel culture story says the same thing about that. It's like, what hurts the most is just, people who you trusted, you went bowling with, they were their best man at your wedding, and suddenly they're retweeting about how you're a white supremacist, stuff like that. But it's, technically speaking, no one took away his speech rights. What does it mean to have free speech rights compromised? Because I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, that would be a legal question. But this isn't really a free speech case. It's a mobbing case, right?
I've said this in a way. I keep saying it's about free speech on campus, but I don't mean free speech in the legal sense, not in the First Amendment sense in the United States, nor in the kind of, is it hate speech? For me, it's about freedom of expression. So if you get mobbed and canceled, then you're not able to speak freely. I have profound sympathy for all the people I talked to, both on and off camera, because we spoke to hundreds of people off the record, Jonathan. I felt like almost a therapist at times with my producer on Zooms, off the record, so people would feel comfortable. People crying. They would start talking about it, and their lives were destroyed. And, of course, it's not war when I say your life is destroyed, but if you lose your friends and you lose your job and you're humiliated and you're socially ostracized, that's social death. That is an extremely powerful deterrent.
Two of the people you profiled, Kathleen Stock, formerly of the University of Sussex in the UK, Carol Hooven, biologist formerly of Harvard, and both of them talked about how they were mercilessly attacked by colleagues, by friends, basically for saying that biological sex is a real thing. They were actually extremely lucid when they were talking about the substance of it. Kathleen Stock talking about how she's a philosopher and she thought people in philosophy should be talking about the philosophy of biology and gender identity. Carol Hooven coming at it from more of an evolutionary biology perspective. But in both cases, the result was the same, speaking plainly about the reality of sex differences and the fact that there are only two sexes, just instantly made them a pariah. Rick, I've known you for a long time. You must have superhuman powers of persuasion that you persuaded CBC, of all places, to broadcast this. I mean, if you follow me on social media, you know that I have a lot of fun with the CBC. Well, the fun's all on my end, but just making fun of some of the, for lack of a better term, woke stuff they put on. How did you persuade the CBC to run this when two of the central figures, given extremely sympathetic, and rightly given extremely sympathetic treatment, Carol Hooven and Kathleen Stock, are people who argue the common sense proposition that biological sex is real, deal with it, which at the CBC is considered borderline hate speech.
It was also on the BBC, which is exactly the same challenge. So I have it on the BBC and CBC.
You're twice as brilliant as I thought. I mean,
That's what I wanted you to say.
yeah, okay. Well, behind that mask of professionalism is a very manipulative, smooth operator.
Exactly.
Yeah, I said exactly what you wanted me to say. But how? How did you do this? This is crazy.
I don't know. I've done a lot of stuff for the CBC. I've been, a filmmaker for a while. Most of my work has been on the CBC. Certainly has not been. I mean, it's been about different topics, sex trafficking, and I did this series called Enslaved about the transatlantic slave trade that was on just around COVID, and the Accountant of Auschwitz. So I have experience with them. So they trusted me as a filmmaker. I think Jen Detman, who finally said yes when
Who was Jen Detman?
Sorry, she is the head of unscripted at the CBC. They backed the project. I think they were nervous about it,
And rightly so.
but also that was a long time ago. I mean, when they backed the project, it was just after Evergreen State College. When I first showed CBC a cut, and I should say this, it was supposed to be a 90-minute film for both the BBC and the CBC. The first cut that we showed them was 5 hours long. That's crazy. I think it took us so long to get to this 5 hours because the story, I just wanted to do justice to the stories. They saw the 5 hours and they doubled their order.
Wow.
And so did the BBC. They said, I get it. I get why it has to be this long because of course the world kept changing. I mean, I think kudos to them. Maybe they're realizing, I don't mean maybe they're realizing it like now, I just mean that there is room for other kinds of programming. I think the film is fair. What worries me more is could a younger filmmaker make a film like this? And I say that because it was very hard getting funding and I was rejected by a lot of the funding agencies here, the two of the main funding agencies, which is fine. I don't want to, it's not sour grapes. I had the film made and people get rejected all the time. Veteran filmmakers get rejected all the time. But I know it's because of the subject matter, at least in some cases. And I feel like I'm experienced, so I was able to go and pre-sell to other territories. A younger filmmaker wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. And that means that we're not going to be able to make films unless they have a certain way of thinking. And that has nothing to do with the CBC. It has to do with the whole industry as a whole.
When you showed the footage, these sort of mobs running amok, it was at Yale, it was Evergreen, then some more recent stuff involving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There were two types of people in those scenes. One was like these 20-year-olds who are screaming about how oppressed they are because, some teacher they don't like hasn't been fired yet. On the other hand, these people are 5 minutes old and everyone says and does stupid things when they're young. We're lucky that they didn't have smartphones when you and I were in college, or there'd be all kinds of embarrassing footage of us. The other group of people who come off extremely poorly in your film are people who are like 50 years old and are administrators and should know better. DEI administrators at Penn. And we haven't talked about him, but there's one guy who basically was run out of
Penn State.
Yeah, because he didn't appreciate being called a white supremacist. And then even more tragicomically, the president of Evergreen State is meeting with protesters and like doing his glassy-eyed about that president. Like it was frightening. It was like watching some sci-fi film where your soul is ripped out of you and you just have to like obey the orders of extraterrestrial crazy people. I know you kept it professional and you didn't sort of jump up on a table and say, you're the president of the university, do something intelligent.
It's very, very hard watching him. They keep saying, stop using your hands, George. Stop using your hands. They're swearing at him. They're abusing him.
Oh, no, it's completely obscene.
Completely obscene. And he wasn't responding, but also, even the police chief, again, she appears for a few minutes in the film, but there was a more extensive interview with her. There had been a lot of things going on that campus, but he was very much on the side of the students.
Talk about Stockholm Syndrome.
Even now, I was in touch with him saying that I wanted to interview him now. And he knows he doesn't look good in that footage.
To say the least.
And he didn't want to be on camera. I can understand why. But he also said that he believed that the students had a legitimate beef, and he wanted to support them. And that's why in the film I say George felt that they had something to say and he was willing to endure a lot to listen. It was my way of saying, I kind of spoke to him. Like I knew that.
Yeah.
It wasn't conjecture. But I don't think it's all just crazy 20-year-old students. And I don't think it's going away so quickly. I understand the pendulum has swung back with Trump and he's shutting everything down in this aggressive way. But DEI and the ideology, I mean, DEI started from what I think is a good place personally, which is welcoming marginalized students, helping people who might not be familiar with the academy, don't have, people don't have books at home, whatever the reasons are, to kind of give a little lift to people who might need that lift. I am 110% for that. I just don't like that it hardened into an ideology where you force professors to make a DEI pledge when they're teaching physics.
Right. By the way, we've had plenty of people on the podcast, and I agree with them, who say DEI originally was fine. You and I are old enough to remember when it was considered okay behavior for some guy to go to the break room at work and tell racist and sexist jokes. And that was just like, oh, boys will be boys. And DEI training was kind of about behavior modification. It's like, you don't need to tell people your sex stories or your stupid jokes or, hang up nudie calendars in the break room, whatever. Like, basically just about being professional at the workplace. You make the point that it then became this kind of psycho-religious thing where it wasn't about modifying your behavior, it was about extirpating this sort of original sin of racism that you have inside you. And then once it became a religious movement, then anybody who dissented became a kind of heretic. And we all know what happens to heretics. But let me ask you about something that happened. I get the sense you were kind of wrapping the film up, and then October 7th happened. By this point, you'd already been working on the film for, I guess, like 6-7 years. And then all of a sudden, there's this free speech crisis, or maybe something more complicated than that, on campuses. And then there's this whole final act to your film where you, who I learned from the film, you're the daughter of Holocaust survivors. There's one guy at Cornell you interviewed, he just seemed like a flat out bigot. He even kind of praised this guy who set himself on fire to protest Israel in Washington. I mean, just like, this guy was a horrifying individual.
The reason why I find myself have an affinity to Palestine is that my faith commands me and instructs me to stand for justice and always side with those who are oppressed.
Last week we saw the Honorable Aaron Bushnell achieve martyrdom.
After dealing with race and gender, I figured what could go wrong if I do October 7th as well?
Might as well, yeah.
Might as well. So one, there were the congressional hearings.
Yeah. The president of MIT, Penn, Harvard, being asked, is it legitimate to call for the genocide of Jews? And they gave these very lawyerly responses that clearly had been written by the general counsel. And it became a scandal. And two of them, not the MIT one, but the Penn and the Harvard one, although the Harvard case more complicated because those plagiarism accusations, but they both resigned.
Dr. Gay, a Harvard student calling for the mass murder of African Americans is not protected free speech at Harvard, correct?
Our commitment to free speech.
It's a yes or no question.
Here's the thing. The truth is, calling for the genocide of Jews is free speech. I mean, she was legally correct. There was a better way.
I'm conflicted when people say, can you say from the river to the sea, which is code for let's get rid of the Jews in Israel. I'm conflicted about that because I am a free speech supporter.
Well, I grapple with that. It became a little more personal. And I say more personal, not that it's so personal, but that I care about this stuff. And it's much harder for me to listen to people saying certain things that I just found hard to hear about that. It was more emotional than I thought. It's a good test to see if I really believe in free speech, but also just how the ideology played in. I didn't want to litigate the war. I wanted to look at the hypocrisy. I found it interesting that Carol Hooven was canceled and not supported by her peers for saying there were two biological sexes, but calling for the genocide of Jews, that was okay.
There's a long section on Christopher Rufo. And for people watching this who don't know, Christopher Rufo has been on this podcast twice. I had him on when no one knew his name. You know, I have a good eye for talent. So, Rick, maybe one day you're going to be as famous as Christopher Rufo.
I'm going to be totally sullied by appearing on your podcast.
Well, yeah, you're probably going to get canceled. But
ruining my entire image.
I don't know, but things have changed so much. It's embarrassing how mainstream Quillette has become. But then he became popular with Trump types, and he became the point man in Florida for educational reforms that made me uneasy because although I'm an opponent of all this ideological excess, I call it progressive illiberalism. Woke is too Fox News. So I say progressive illiberalism, which is more like black turtleneck. I don't like that stuff, but I also don't think government should be the answer to that. I want progressive intellectuals to get over this movement on their own. It makes me uncomfortable when someone like Christopher Rufo and his political allies in Florida take a top-down solution and say, you can't teach gender studies. The cure becomes worse than the disease in some cases. Putting that aside, Christopher Rufo, we can all agree, is now a right-wing culture warrior. Some people listening to this may be just fine with that. You gave him a lot of airtime, and you gave him sympathetic airtime. You were in his car. How did you get so friendly? Like, you're just this random Canadian filmmaker. Like, how did you get so much access to the guy?
So it's so funny. You keep going, how'd you get the CBC?
Yeah.
That's the job. That's my magic,
Okay,
Jonathan. But anyway, I couldn't get you though.
Oh, I said in the intro, I was totally skeptical of your project because I was like, well, it's a moving target and this issue changes every 20 minutes. And how can a film capture it? But I guess the art is in answering all those questions. But you somehow said to Christopher Rufo, I'm a Canadian filmmaker. I'm doing a documentary on free speech that's going to take 75 years to make. Let me follow you around all week. And he said yes.
It wasn't like that, but I was very interested in Christopher Rufo because when Ron DeSantis decided to make education the center of his war on woke, it was clear, I can't remember the timeline. It's all a bit of a blur, that there was going to be a pendulum swing. And of course it's Florida and of course it's DeSantis. But the fact that they were attacking the very
New College, which is like the most progressive part of the system.
New College is like the Florida equivalent of Evergreen. It's really hard with Rufo because that car scene is coming back to haunt me a lot. It was actually my producer who was in the car with him, but we wanted to follow him a little bit more because we weren't filming with Trump, but he was
surrogate. He's like a surrogate for that point of view.
Yeah. And there was it was the first college that got rid of DEI in gender studies. Look, Trump came in a couple of years later and he got rid of DEI altogether. But this was how it happened. I just thought, here we have something on the ground where we can look and see, and I can find, if we could, and we did in the end, track down the DEI director and track down the people who were affected by what he did. I wanted a story that was complete where you'd meet everyone.
And you gave her a lot of time too. Excuse me.
I gave Zur a lot of time.
Zur. So this is, yes. Oh, God. That is how she identifies. Passing over that, I'm sure you already have, but you're going to get a lot of grief for giving Christopher Rufo so much time. On the other hand, featuring him is kind of consistent with your overarching hypothesis, which is like, if you push a liberal progressive ideology down people's throats so aggressively and for so long, there's going to be a backlash. And it's a movie, so the backlash has to have a name and a face, and that name and the face is Christopher Rufo.
If you believe that a man can become a woman, or if you believe that a man can get pregnant and give birth to a child, what you're saying is simply not true. And if you're saying something so obviously untrue that could be easily debunked by anyone over the age of maybe 3 or 4, you do not merit a place in a scholarly institution. We have not only the right, but we have the obligation to say, I will not participate in this. And that's why, for example, I don't use they, them pronouns or ze-zer pronouns, much less. I'm currently under Department of Education civil rights investigation, following a complaint that I did not use ze-zer pronouns for the New College of Florida's DEI director.
The thing that's amazing about Rufo, he's unabashed about what he says what he means, and he does what he says. It's like when you said, when I talked to Asao Inouye, the guy who says English is a language of the oppressor. That's what you want. You want people who aren't skirting around the issues, who are really telling you what they believe. And listen to when people say what they believe. So I thought Rufo was really interesting because he says, I don't believe in this stuff. I don't want this stuff. And I want to set up Florida as an example. And it was like, oh my God, that was before Trump got in. And then, Trump started campaigning on that kind of promise of education. If you remember correctly, that there was an ad, Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you. That ad
tested through the roof.
It was unbelievable. I almost had it in the film. I mean, it's just he was playing exactly that identity politics game.
Kamala supports transgender sex changes in jail with our money.
Kamala even supports letting biological men compete against our girls in their sports. Kamala is for they, them. President Trump is for you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
And by the way, we spent more time with Ruth than you think because I went to his home and met his family. It just didn't make it into the film. And I got criticized for being too friendly because we were in the car with him. But it's not about friendly. It's about having someone who's being so frank on camera and admitting this is a game. He knows it's working in his favor because he's going to get what he wants.
Took you 9 or 10 years to do this. Is this like your Citizen Kane? Is this your Gone with the Wind? Or are you working on another decade-long doc project now?
Well, in my defense, first of all, I started in 2017, but I made 2 films and there was COVID in between.
Oh, no, I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you if you want to do all this again.
No, never. No, I mean, I do have another project, but I find this has been, I would say it's the hardest film I've ever made by far. My editor says the same thing. The person I'm producing with, it's been very hard, just not only emotionally, but also there's a lot of resistance. I come from a lefty community, the doc community. Everything about it has been hard. Anyway, whatever. I don't want to whine about how hard it was to make this film. I'm so lucky that I made it, and I'm mostly really happy that it's on mainstream, like on CBC and BBC. So hopefully people will see it and see a little bit of themselves in it.
Well, look, if any of your super orthodox progressive friends are on your case, you just come back at them and assure them and say, hey, Jon Kay liked the movie and I was on the Quillette podcast, and that will silence their criticism.
Oh, of course. That's what I do.
I'm just kidding. You're finished.
Well, yeah. I know that.
Okay.
I know that. And I'm going to keep it a secret, actually.
Okay. Sorry, Rick. So we're having this conversation April 15th. The first 90-minute segment was on CBC, the main station. It was on last night. The other one is on tonight. It's available on CBC Gem, which is a digital service.
If you're in the UK, it's on BBC iPlayer, so it'll be playing there in total. And then it's going to be in Germany on WDR, on Arte in France, on Danish television.
Ric Bienstock, thank you for being on the Quillette podcast. I'll have a lot more time for your questions and inquiries the next time I see you while we're walking dogs.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.